Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time around, it is my review of the Decline of Western Civilization Trilogy. It is a series of documentary films directed by filmmaker Penelope Spheeris that center around different aspects of music, specifically punk rock and heavy metal. Now, before I get around to sharing more of my thoughts on this series of films, I would like to give a special shout out to Vontae for requesting this review. And if there's another film, TV show, or topic that you would like to see me discuss in the future, feel free to donate to either my PayPal or to my Patreon, and I will try to get to your request as soon as I possibly can. The link to both is in the video description if you are interested. Now, the first documentary in this trilogy is called The Decline of Western Civilization, and it's directed by Penelope Spheeris. This was her directorial debut. Before this, she had done some shorts, but this was the first time that she helmed a feature film. And I think for a first time filmmaker, this is quite an achievement, especially when it comes to a documentary of this size and scope. She shot this over the span of at least a couple years, and it was a really wide and deep kind of topic to approach for a first time filmmaker. And she pulled it off and did a remarkable job. And really, she made me appreciate punk rock and punk in general more than I did prior to watching this documentary. Because I'm going to be honest here, I've never really been a super big fan of punk or punk rock, and I guess I didn't really understand or get what the big deal was about it. I thought it was just a lot of heavy guitar and percussion and just ranting vocals, just people sounding like they're pissed off. And I thought that it was mostly just heavily political. And this documentary really opened my eyes in terms of the wide array and variety of different types of punk, and also why people were fans of the genre of music. And I will say this is more of a concert film first and a documentary second, because it doesn't really follow your typical documentary style or structure. It's more of a series of music acts from different punk uh, rockers and punk bands that is cut together with an occasional interview with a supposed expert in the field of punk rock, or people who work at a punk rock magazine called Slash, or the artists themselves. And there's also some other stuff with the fans that are the focus. But a good chunk of the documentary is just heavily focused on these music acts. And the bands that are featured here are Alice Bag Band, Black Flag, Circle Jerks, Catholic Discipline, Fear, Germs, and X. And for the most part, I liked the majority of these acts. And coming from a guy who's not really a huge punk fan, that's a pretty decent accomplishment. I liked Black Flag set. I liked Alice Bag Band's set. Circle Jerks I had fun with. Uh, Fear. I was familiar with Fear because I know that John Belushi was a big fan of Fear, and Fear is rather infamous when it comes to SNL because they were a music act for, I think, the first, not the first season, of course, but like the infamous sixth season, which was the first season after the original cast left the show. And they did a music act that became infamous because they played a song, I think, Let's Start a War, that they were not supposed to. I mean, Let's Have a War, that's what it's called. And that led to them actually getting banned, if I remember correctly. They were banned from SNL. One of the few bands that have that distinction. Um, then you had the Germs and X. Uh, X I liked the most. I really liked their set. Honestly, I loved the entire part of the film that focused on X. The interviews with the band, that was really fun, and just really got to know them, and they just seemed like really cool, unique people that were relatively grounded. Didn't seem like they were, pretentious or anything like that. Like Catholic discipline, for instance. And they had some real, genuine talent all across the board, and not just with certain parts of the band, like with Germs. And I know a lot of people are going to probably flame me for this, but I didn't care for Germs. I didn't like their set. I thought both their songs sucked. Um, and the main reason for that is because of Darby Crash. I know Darby Crash has this reputation of being this pioneer punk rock, and I know he has this fan base in the queer community because he was a closeted punk rocker, and he has a certain infamy associated with him, or fame. Infamy maybe isn't the right word. Uh, and he also happens to be one of those artists that flamed out very young after only doing one album because he ultimately took his life pretty soon after the one and the only album they did was completed. But to me, I thought he was terrible. And I know punk rock is not a genre that is really something that puts a significant emphasis on the quality of vocals. A lot of it's about attitude and about how the punk rock singer uses their vocal inflection and so on and so forth. Darby Crash to me sounded like an absolute train wreck, and not in a good way. He sounded like your average drunk at the bar. It was unintelligible nonsense most of the time for me, and it was really obnoxious. Like it wasn't what I consider to be quality singing or vocals, or honestly quality punk. Like everyone else around him, like his guitarist and the rhythm guy, the drummer, the percussion, even like the lyrics, which I think he also helped write. Like he seemed to be a pretty decent lyricist, but as a performer, I thought he was just brutal, man. Like, and not in a good way. Like, just really brutal to listen to because it was just shut down my. He sounded like a drunken fool, and I couldn't take him seriously, and I just couldn't stand listening to him. Just spout unintelligible gibberish and nonsense loudly into the microphone. But that's just me personally. I know a lot of people like Germs. I'm not one of those people. I liked X though, and I liked Fear's set, and I like Circle Jerks and Black Flag and Alice Bagban. Catholic Discipline was the other set I wasn't really big on, mainly because it just sounded way too pretentious. Like it really reminded me of something you would hear at a coffee bar where they're doing poetry slams and people would be snapping after the performance. It was that kind of vibe, and I'm not really into that. Um, Plus, the guy who's like the lead singer of that band just seemed like a pretentious wanker to me. So that's just my take on it. But the rest of the bands, they're pretty solid, pretty good. Um, and I liked the bit where they were talking about the magazine Slash. I liked the few interviews they had with different fans of punk, and it was just one of those documentaries that was just really interesting and fascinating to me. You had some music acts that were, for the most part, pretty good for what they were. And Spheeris shot them in a way that really did make it feel like you were right there in the audience. And she really captured the raw authenticity of punk at the time in Los Angeles in the late 70s and early 80s. And it makes for a really compelling time capsule in a myriad of different ways. And I like the way that it was edited too. It really seemed to match the punk aesthetic. And it's just a movie that I honestly would recommend, especially if you're a fan of music. And even if you're not a big fan of punk rock, I still think there's a lot to glean from it. The interviews of the different artists and the bands really did a good job making you feel like you're in their shoes and get to know them better on a more personal level. And that kind of interview was way ahead of its time. It became something that was like the norm years and years later when it comes to like VJs and MTV interviewing different bands, or going to their crib, or going to their uh, uh, place and doing interviews. And yeah, it's considered a revolutionary documentary for a legitimate reason, especially when it comes to music documentaries, because it really did break down a lot of doors and break down barriers and really create a path for other music documentary filmmakers to follow. Now, the sequel, the Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, The Metal Years, that one to me was a disappointment. And I'm not going to sit here and say that it sucked or it was bad. No, I thought it was at least a time waster and it was okay. But considering the reputation that particular installment has, especially among metal and rock fans, this was nowhere near as good as its reputation suggests to me. It was a pretty big letdown, especially as somebody who is a big fan of metal, and even metal from that era of the 80s. I actually don't mind some hair metal, but specifically, I don't like glam metal for the most part, other than like maybe a little bit of Cinderella, maybe one or two songs from Faster Pussycat, some stuff from Motley Crue. But other than that, like, I really do not like glam metal at all. And specifically Poison, who is poison to me. They're ear poison. And Poison is interviewed in this. I'm like, oh God, great. I got to listen to Brett Michaels and the rest of the band Bloviate. Oh God. And so much of this documentary isn't even really focused on, in my opinion, real metal. Like, you got Aerosmith interviewed. Aerosmith is not a metal band. At least not to me. I've never considered them a metal band. You have these over the top interviews of Gene Simmons and Paul Stanley, which are just cringe, especially when you know about how big of total frauds Kiss are, especially Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons when it comes to metal. They are the epitome of metal posers. And then when it comes to like real true blue, just through and through metal artists, like you just have like an interview or two with Alice Cooper. Lemmy from Motorhead is interviewed for a bit. You also have Ozzy Osbourne. But so much of it is focused on bands that weren't really that big yet, like Faster Pussycat, or just complete utter no name bands like Seduce and Odin, who I had never heard of until I watched this documentary, or London, which is another band I had never really listened to or even knew existed. And apparently, they had a bunch of different members throughout the years who left to be in bigger bands. And that's honestly the most interesting bit of trivia about London. And there's like a good chunk of the documentary that isn't even focused on metal music. It's this stupid dance contest at Gazari's where you have this skeevy old man who runs this club and this bar where they shot a good chunk of the music acts at, and he has this contest with all these scantily clad women who are dancing to see who's going to be Miss Gazari and win $1,000. And I'm like, what the hell does this have to do with the topic of the documentary? What does this have to do with anything? Like, are these women hot? Yeah, but if I want to watch that, I'll go watch porn. Why the hell am I watching? And most of it's soft core, so it's like, oh, if I want that, I'll just watch an actual porn instead of watching this soft core porn bullshit that is just at a lot of times really cringe inducing to watch because of just how objectifying it is of these women. And I'm just like, what is the point of this? And there's interviews with people who are fans of metal, and you have these really cringe inducing and hilarious interviews with these people who are just so determined that they're going to make it. And Penelope Spheeris will like try to bring them back to reality a little bit and be like, hey, what if you don't make it? And then they're like, no, no, but I will make it. I'm gonna make it. It is like, but what if you don't? But I will. And newsflash, most of these people that were interviewed definitely didn't make it. You've got Odin, who is just so overconfident that it's just hilarious. They're thinking that they were passed over and that they're going to be these big stars. And ultimately, their biggest claim to fame is their place in this movie. Other than that, they didn't do jack shit. Um, yeah, it's just one of those things where there is a bit of entertainment that could be had from this documentary, like the interview with Ozzy, where he's making breakfast and he spills the orange juice. Apparently, though, that was staged, but it was a fun gag. So I think that was a good call by the filmmakers to stage that one. Um, and I liked hearing from Alice Cooper, who is one of my personal favorite metal artists, and Lemmy, who I also really love and I respect, and I liked hearing his thoughts on the topic. And Megadeth, their bit was really, really fantastic, and it was a great closer for the film. And of course, you have the infamous interview with Chris Holmes from Wasp, where he's completely just drunk off his ass in a pool. That's definitely a moment in the documentary that stands out. Uh, and speaking of staging things, apparently some of that interview was also staged, like the bit where he pours vodka in his eyes. Of course, that was staged. There's no way he was actually pouring real vodka in his eyes. He'd go blind. Um, and it was fun to see like Ricky Rockman, who was, I think he was in Headbangers Ball. I think that's what he was on, like an MTV. Yeah, he was the host of Headbangers Ball, and he's there with Tammy Down, who is the co-owner of the Cat House Club in LA, and it was fun to see him. And the cat house scene was a fun bit of sleaze and metal, and had one of the better music acts other than Megadeth and Faster Pussycat and maybe Lizzie Borden. Like Lizzie Borden was also featured in this, and they did a cover of Born to Be Wild that's not too bad. But the problem is with a lot of these glam metal bands, so much of their songs just sound so similar and just so generic sounding. And that's a big reason why I wasn't really a huge fan of glam metal, and I still am not, because it's just so generic and everything sounds the same and it's boring. And I'm not a big fan of the whiny vocals. And yeah, Lizzie Borden, Faster Pussycat, Seduce, London, Odin. Like the best music uh act is one song, and it's In My Darkest Hour by Megadeth that closes the documentary. If you compare this to the first film, you had multiple music acts that were really of genuine high quality when it comes to their genre of music that the documentary was focusing on. Um, but here it's just slim pickings and a lot of songs that I just never want to listen to again, like Russian Winter, Breakout, Crash Landing, Colleen, even the Faster Pussycat songs. Like I don't mind that band. They have some other good songs other than House of Pain. They did a cover of You're So Vain. I think it was a Carly Simon song that I didn't mind. But a lot of these songs like Cat House, Bathroom Wall, I Got Your Number on the Bathroom Wall. Like what? And Odin with their Little Gypsy and 12 o'clock high, and just the pretentious lead singer who thought that he was the hottest shit ever, and he just sounds like Roxo from Metalocalypse. I can't. I can't fucking speak right now for some reason. I think it's because I'm just so discombobulated by just how just delusional Odin was and how so many people were when it comes to their interviews in this documentary. And I have a hard time saying metal apocalypse. I've always had a hard time saying that. It's like a tongue twister for me from hell. But yeah, it's just one of those movies that at least it goes by at a pretty quick pace. It's like only 90 some minutes. And there is some fun to be had when it comes to some of the interviews of the more well known, well established, well respected metal artists. But I'm just like, what really is the focus of this either? Like the decline of Western civilization, the first film, it seemed like there was a more clearer focus. There was something that Penelope Spheeris is really trying to discuss in terms of uh, the impact that punk is having on society and how society itself is influencing punk rock. But you didn't really necessarily get that from this. If the decline of Western civilization in this is just people being smug and arrogant and delusional, okay, and being obsessed with material things and money, all right, that is in a lot of ways what the 80s was. It was the decade of excess. But what other arguments are you trying to make here? She didn't even really ask the tough questions when it comes to the wannabe metal artists that were interviewed or the metal fans. And still had just a lot of stuff that didn't appeal to me or was average at best. Yeah, or stuff that's just out of place. Like there's this whole portion of the film that features a parole officer who's talking about demettaling metal fans, and maybe was there for comedic value, but I just didn't really get why it was there. It seemed like it was just filler. And yeah, it's just a documentary that, yeah, I understand. It's covering the glam metal subgenre and the heavy metal club scene in Los Angeles in the late 80s, but it's just one of those documentaries, man, where if you're a fan of this topic, especially metal, like you're not really gonna learn a whole lot of anything new, and also you're gonna be inundated with a lot of just shitty metal music, which makes it really hard to watch at times. Um, but I'm not gonna sit here and say that it was outright terrible. But I was disappointed by it. I made that very blatantly clear, and I would say it's one of the bigger disappointments I've seen as of late, considering how much I like this genre of music. Like I just expected way better than what I got here. It was just as vacuous and empty as majority of the glam metal songs were that were popular around this time. And I will say this one more thing about this documentary. It seems like it put an end to the glam metal era of metal, and if that's its long lasting achievement, good. I'm glad it got made. I'm really happy that it got made just to end that heinous era of metal. The third film in the trilogy is called The Decline of Western Civilization Part 3. Now, this is my least favorite out of the three. And the reason for that is that it's barely even connected to this series. It's one of those movies that it seems like it was only made because of the fact that it was considered the third film, and that's why it got financing. Otherwise, it wouldn't have really gotten enough funding to get made. And it's one of those documentaries that I do appreciate in terms of putting a spotlight on something that isn't really talked about that much in the homeless gutter punks of Los Angeles, or just gutter punks in general. But it definitely isn't really as focused as some of the other two documentaries in the series. And it's a lot harder to watch. And I think that's the other thing. That's why it's my least favorite, in all honesty, is that it's a bit too real and raw at times, and it makes it just a rough watch. And I'm not super big on those kind of documentaries or those kind of films in general, although I really love Suburbia. I thought that film was fantastic. And honestly, I think that's a better gutter punk kind of movie than this one. But I would still say that it's ultimately okay for what it is. It's just not my personal cup of tea. That's really how I would frame it. And honestly, just going back to punk just felt kind of been there, done that. So when she's interviewing the different people who are fans of punk, or talking to other artists like the lead singer of Circle Jerks and hearing his thoughts and opinions on punk all these years later, it just feels like it's a retread. It's going over really familiar ground. So when you have those portions of the documentary, it's not as interesting or as cringe fun as at least the interviews in part two were. So what you have is just these interviews that just kind of exist and don't really provide a whole lot of extra thought. Like there's not a lot of thought provoking elements to these other interviews. And when it comes to the gutter punks, like there's only so much you can do. And I appreciate the slice of life moments of the gutter punks, and I like the scenes that focus on the members of the band, the Resistance, and I actually didn't mind the Resistance is set as well. I thought they actually had some pretty decent songs. I would say that out of the four bands that were filmed in this, uh, which were Final Conflict, Limited Screen, Naked Aggression, and the Resistance, I thought the Resistance were definitely the best band. And the other ones though were mostly forgettable, like Final Conflict, Limited Screen. Naked Aggression stood out to me, but that's mainly because of just how hyper political they were, specifically going after the right wing. They were very leftist. And also, the lead singer looks like your sociology professor at college. Like, she gives that vibe, as well as angry Melissa McCarthy, which was really something that kind of threw me for a loop when I first saw the first musical act from Naked Aggression, and the lead singer, she's doing her whole thing where she's being pissed off and angry and angsty, and she literally looks like an angry Melissa McCarthy. Like it gives Melissa McCarthy vibes, and it made me laugh. And I know that's probably not the intent, but I couldn't help it. Um, And you also have like Flea from Red Hot Chili Peppers. He was also part of Fear. He has a little interview. Rick Wilder is interviewed from the Mau Mau's. Uh, and like this guy is skin and bones and looks like death. And honestly, I don't remember anything that he said. And the gutter punk stuff, like some of them really did just seem like they were hyping, well, not really hyping things up, but exaggerating things for the camera or just in general. Some of them seem like they were just spoiled rich kids who just didn't want to adhere to the norms of society, or didn't want to listen to their parents anymore, so they went out and lived on the street. Um, but there were other people who were interviewed who you genuinely felt for, because they spoke openly about why they were on the street, because Penelope actually went there and asked them these questions, and some of the gutter punks actually answered, and they answered very candidly and openly, talking about how, well, they were abused at home, or they had some other things that happened to them that made it so they wound up on the street. um there was one of them in particular who was in a wheelchair because he was involved in a car accident, and he was the only one of them that actually had his own place because he was able to use disability payments to be able to afford his own home. And there's this whole scene where all these gutter punks who are supposedly his friends are crashing at his house, and they are having this massive party, and I think it's supposed to be a birthday party, but the camera is on this disabled man. He doesn't look happy, and you can't blame him because these guys are trashing his house. They're like vomiting everywhere. They broke the toilets, and it just seems like they're just being a bunch of assholes. And it doesn't necessarily paint them in this, oh hey, we're just friends, we really love you. Like, they say it, but like, if you really loved this guy, then you wouldn't trash his house. You know, this isn't the same as your squat. This is this guy's house. um, there was a bit where Penelope shot some footage of the gutter punks when they had an apartment for a month, and it was just pure chaos. And so much of their philosophy and so much of the things that they do is just they get drunk. They get drunk and they panhandle, and that's it. And honestly, it doesn't make for the most compelling documentary because that just gets old after a while. Where you're like, okay, all right, you're okay. You're doing another interview. Oh, they're explaining why they're on the street. Oh, they were abused. This person was abused too, or uh, this happened. Okay, all right. uh what do they do, or what do they want to do in their life? Oh, just get drunk. Okay, all right. Where do you think they'll be, you will be in 5 years, dead or doing the same thing? It's like after a certain point that just gets kind of dull and very repetitive. And then when you get to the more compelling stuff, it's almost near the end of the documentary, like when you get to the bit where you find out one of the gutter punks who showed up at the disabled guy's party for a brief little moment. You find out that he died in a fire, and Penelope interviews uh his friends, and you get to see some really genuine emotion and just sadness from the gutter punks when it comes to the loss of their friend. And that really harsh dose of reality definitely does leave an impact. And there's a lot of those moments throughout the documentary as well, but that's the one that really uh, hit the hardest for me. Other than the bit that you find out at the end of the documentary that Squids was killed by one of his supposed friends, which is just all kinds of messed up. And that's the thing. This documentary, it's a massive big bummer. It's just sad. And I know that's the point. It's trying to show a sad truth about these homeless gutter punks in Los Angeles. But man, it's just one of those things where, yeah, I appreciate it for putting a spotlight, to use that term again, on this topic and this subsect of society that is rarely discussed, let alone shown in such a manner. And it definitely does a good job making the gutter punks into figures that you definitely do sympathize with to a certain point, but at the same time, you kind of just wish they would just try a little harder in terms of getting out of the situation that they're in. But then when there's other things that are explained in certain terms of outside factors and other triggers and other reasons why they're in their position, you understand their mindset a little bit more. So you get why they would rather live on the street or continue to live on the street than any other alternative. And to be honest, some people they just can't really be a part of regular society. And I do feel that some of the individuals that were featured here definitely would fit that bill. Um and I did like how punk rock and things like that were incorporated into it, and the little moments where Penelope interviews the gutter punks and they explain why they wear what they wear or why they decided to adopt the punk rock aesthetic and fashion and what it means to them. And there's at least one punk rock act that was decent. But yeah, it was just one of those documentaries where I personally didn't find it to be anything particularly special, but it at least did talk about a lesser known part of society, but the questions that were asked by Spheeris, the structure of the documentary, it just led to something that just wasn't really that satisfying as a whole, and just kind of a weak way to end this series of films. Honestly, I would have been more interested if she did a different music genre or something for this documentary, focused on some other sort of music genre that she's not necessarily as familiar with, maybe break outside her comfort zone a little bit more. Um, but that's just me personally, because the music aspect of this documentary is very distant and just barely even there. And that's the biggest selling point of these documentaries for me, is the music stuff, is the element of these documentaries that talk about music in general. And this was more about just homeless teenagers, and that just isn't as interesting to me personally. But that's just my thoughts on the Decline of Western Civilization trilogy. I definitely liked some of them a lot more than others, but it was still a experience that I'm glad that I took part in, at least once, because it really did provide a lot of different perspectives, and it really did place a certain focus on different genres of music or different kinds of people that I normally wouldn't pay attention to or really uh, decide to investigate or learn about on my own. So it definitely did broaden my horizons, and I would say if any of these films sound interesting to you, I would definitely give them a look. But anyway, that's my thoughts on this trilogy. And until next time, I'll see you later. See ya.